So yeah, this just happened, and well, I've actually had this camera for about a month now, and I've been shooting almost exclusively with this while also testing this against my EOS R. And I wasn't planning on buying a Sony camera, but I just happened to find a really good deal, and I thought it would be a good opportunity for me to test out the Sony system. And oh, by the way, this isn't one of those Canon users switching to Sony type of videos. I have no plans to switch to Sony anytime soon, and if anything, I'll just keep using both unless I have some serious problems with either one of these cameras, but I don't think that will be the case. Even until like 5 or 10 years ago, I don't think it was all that common for photographers to be switching camera brands or even to think about switching camera brands. But now with the whole full-frame mirrorless market, which is still relatively new, I think a lot of people are kind of constantly questioning, you know, do I have the right camera, or is this the right camera system to invest in, or am I going to regret this next year? And these two are some of the most popular full-frame mirrorless cameras right now, so I thought this video might be helpful to those of you who are maybe thinking about switching or trying to decide between these two cameras by sharing my honest opinions and insights about the A7 III as a longtime EOS R user. And I know I'm like almost 2 years late on this review, so I'm not going to go through all the little specs and details about this camera on this video. This video is more about my general experience with the A7 III as a Canon user, and you know, all the things that I learned and things that I liked, things that I didn't like about the camera, and all the things that I think the A7 III does better or worse than the EOS R. You know, if anybody asked me a year ago which camera I would choose, and if I wasn't a Canon shooter, I probably would have picked the A7 III just based on the features and specs alone. But in such a short amount of time, the EOS R and the Canon RF mount system have matured quite a bit, and Canon released so many good new lenses this year, and like they came out with like 9 lenses this year just for this camera mount alone, and they released like 4 firmware updates just for this camera alone. And you know, this is a completely different camera now compared to just a few months ago, and I think these two cameras are a lot more closely matched than what a lot of people thought before. And although I've never tried the A7 III before, because this camera has been out for a while now, and because I'm someone who spends a lot of time on YouTube, I already had a pretty good understanding of the camera's limitations and capabilities and how it's going to fare against the Canon EOS R. And so I had some expectations of my own before I started any side-by-side comparisons. I expected that the A7 III would have better image quality than the EOS R, and you know, everyone raves about the Sony sensors and everyone says Canon sensors are garbage. But I just wanted to see exactly how much better the A7 III was compared to the EOS R with things like dynamic range and low light performance. I never had any complaints about the image quality on the EOS R or the 5D Mark IV. And you know, when you're comparing two things, just because one is better than the other, it doesn't mean the other one is terrible. So I just wanted to compare the images myself and see exactly how much difference there was, and if this is something that I've been missing out on, or if this is something that I'm not going to care. I expected that Sony would have better autofocus in still shooting. You know, Sony's been working on this for a long time now, and they've also been perfecting their eye autofocus for a few years now, and Canon made a big jump with their latest firmware update on their eye autofocus. So I just wanted to see how close they were, or if the Sony was still miles ahead. And a lot of people talk about Canon colors. You know, a lot of people like Canon color science. But surprisingly, color is not something that I always pay close attention to, because you know, color is subjective, and no matter how good or bad the colors are, I'm going to be editing the photos one way or another, so it doesn't really affect my workflow. But you also have to remember that this is more of a camera versus camera type of debate, not a Canon versus Sony type of debate, because if you compare the colors from the EOS R to any other Canon cameras, the color might be completely different. And if you compare the colors on the A7 III with A7 II or A7 R4, they might be completely different. So this is more of an EOS R versus A7 III type of debate, not a Canon versus Sony type of debate. But I was still curious to see exactly what the differences are in the images. A lot of people also talk about how terrible Sony's menu design is. I just wanted to see how much of that was true. And you know, Canon cameras in general are known to be very intuitive and easy to use. but I just wanted to test out the A7 III and see if the menu system was something that I could get used to or if it's something that I'm gonna hate for the rest of my life. So let's talk about image quality. Long story short, the A7 III did perform better, but not by much. Maybe my expectations were too unrealistic. Considering the EOS R has 6 more megapixels, I was honestly expecting the A7 III to blow the Canon out of the water, but in reality, 1 or 2 stops of difference may not mean much to me. Once you get up to ISO 25600, you can see the difference in the noise. Once you get up to 40,000, the difference becomes much more clear. Even over 50,000, the Sony still beats the Canon. But I never shoot in that range anyway. In the past 5 years or so, I probably shot in ISO that high for less than 10 times. Maybe if you shoot a lot of weddings in dark venues where you're not allowed to use flash, then this might be useful, but in most cases, I couldn't really see the difference. With dynamic range, again, the Sony was a little bit better when you're just comparing the noise level, but I think I'm willing to give that up for some extra megapixels. You have to remember that when it comes to comparing image quality, there's no fine line that determines good and bad images. It's all about your tolerances. Some people may be okay with this and some people may not. Sometimes you may think it's bad, but your clients may not care. So if this much difference really means a lot to you, then just rent one of these cameras and test them out yourself. Personally, I wouldn't consider switching to Sony just for the image quality alone. I did see some difference in colors, but I wouldn't necessarily consider one better than the other. In general, the images from the EOS R seem to retain more green, while the A7 III's images lean more towards red and blue. I had no problem manipulating the colors on both cameras' images, and I wouldn't mind using either one for professional use. It's just a matter of personal taste. When it comes to video quality, there's really no apples to apples comparison because the specs on these cameras are so different. Canon's 4K has much higher bitrate, but it has more crop, while Sony's 4K had much lower bitrate, it didn't have a crop. So if you're someone who needs to shoot 4K in full frame, then the Sony is the obvious answer, but in 4K 30, the Sony also has a little bit of the crop. I'm not the most sophisticated video person to talk about things like bitrate, but both videos looked pretty good to me. Comparing the 1080 performance is more of a direct comparison, but I'm not really sure how many people who buy Sony cameras are going to be shooting in 1080. And of course, the big bonus on the Sony is the slow-mo 1080p option in 120 frames per second. It's not something I use all the time, but it's nice to have that option. On the Canon, you get 720p 120 frames per second slow motion option, but you lose autofocus and also audio. So again, if you're someone who's buying one of these cameras for video, you just really have to weigh out your options and see which ones you're going to be using. For me, I don't use 4K that often, and my channel isn't really about beautiful visuals and slow motion B-rolls. My channel is more about the content and the information that I provide to you. But if you're more of a travel or lifestyle vlogger, then having 4K and slow motion might be beneficial to you. Next up is autofocus performance. This did surprise me a little bit. Again, I thought the A7 III's autofocus would be a lot better, but the EOS R fared really well. So here's the thing, when it comes to eye autofocus, the A7 III was a bit better at finding subjects' eyes, and also while it was farther away from the subject. But once I started shooting bursts, it lost track of the subject very quickly. I thought it was because the burst rate was too quick and the shutter was interfering with the AF system, so I slowed down the camera a bit and tried again, but I got the same results. The EOS R, on the other hand, it continued to track the subject until the buffer was completely full. I was also using a faster card on the Sony, by the way. There were a couple of shots that it missed focus, but the overall hit rate was pretty impressive. So the conclusion is, the EOS R does a better job tracking the subject while shooting, and the A7 III's tracking wasn't as good, but it made up in the frame rate. So if you shoot a lot of quick bursts here and there, you might get better results with the Sony. But if you're someone who professionally shoots a lot of action, I think I would recommend cameras like the 1DX or an A9 instead. With video autofocus though, the Canon was the clear winner. It did a much better job tracking subjects, and also having eye autofocus is extremely helpful for shooting human subjects with a full frame camera like this with a fast prime. But when it comes to simply autofocusing, both cameras did really well. The A7 III's touchscreen is mostly useless, but you can use it while shooting video to focus, so that's really nice. I also got the 5th generation Metabones adapter, and I've heard so many horror stories about adapters, but it actually worked really well. All of my EF lenses worked perfectly on the A7 III, even the eye autofocus. The only lens that struggled a little bit was the 85 1.2, but that's a slow lens on Canon cameras too. But all the other lenses worked really well, and I was pleasantly surprised. But for video, on the other hand, the autofocus just does not work. It's virtually non-existent. Which brings me to the next point, the usability and ergonomics. There's a lot to talk about here, so here's a little summary. I do think the Sony's menu system is definitely worse, but it gets better overused. Sony could benefit a lot from a touchscreen. The EOS R is more comfortable in hands, but having a smaller camera is nice too. The A7 III feels a bit laggy overall. It's not a deal breaker, but something I just noticed because I was comparing it against the EOS R. Really love the dual card slots on the A7 III, but I wish both of them were UHS 2. USB charging on the A7 III is nice, but it's really slow and I wish the camera came with a charger. Battery life was great on both cameras, no complaints there. And again, I really wish the A7 III had a flip-out touchscreen. So I think I generally agree with people who say that Sony's menu design is terrible, but it did get better over time. So the main difference that I found is, with Canon, when you want to do something, you can pretty much always figure out how to get there relatively quickly. For example, let's say I want to change my white balance. With the Sony, I know I programmed it as this button, but sometimes I might forget that. Then I'm in trouble. With the EOS R, I don't even have to go into the menu, I can do it all on the touchscreen. And also not having a touchscreen means I have to manually go through each tab with my D-pad. Again, things like this get a lot better over time with constant use, but if you're coming from the Canon world, you're definitely going to be looking up some tutorials on how to do things. The overall ergonomics of the camera is definitely better on the EOS R, like most people probably expected. Coming from the 5Ds, I never really considered the EOS R to be the most comfortable camera to use. The body design and the size was more similar to the 6D, I would say, than the 5Ds. And I have bigger than average sized hands, so it never really felt quite big enough for my hands. But despite that, every time I come back to it from the Sony, it just felt a million times better. The A7 III felt pretty good though, especially compared to some of their older cameras. But perhaps because of the bigger grip, when I'm using bigger lenses, my fingers get wedged in between the lens and the grip. Not a big deal, and again, most people won't have this issue, but when I sometimes grip the camera in a hurry in the wrong way, this can actually hurt a bit. I did some research on this and ended up getting an extension grip on the A7 III, and this made the camera feel 100 times better. It's such a simple thing, but it's really nice to be able to distribute the weight on wider areas while not adding too much weight and bulk to the camera like a battery grip. It is $130 though, and there are lots of cheaper third-party options, but I wanted to see how Sony solved this problem. So if you have bigger hands or if you're coming from a DSLR, I would highly recommend going to a local camera store and trying this out yourself. And I know this was a bigger issue with some of their older cameras, but the Sony still feels a bit laggy to me. It definitely takes a lot longer to start up than my Fujis and Canons, and also when you're quickly going through the menus, it skips a lot of frames. And also, unlike on the Canon, when the buffer is filled up, there's really not much you can do on the menus. For example, when I filled up my buffer on the Sony, I wanted to slow down my frame rate, but even to do that, I had to wait till all the images were written. I really like having dual card slots on my cameras, and again, on the Sony, only one of them is UHS 2. This is probably Sony pulling a Canon to protect their A9 sales, which is a shame because on cameras like the EOS R, having UHS 2 cards doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but on the A7 III, the whole camera's performance is bottlenecked by the second card, and the fact that the things you can do on the camera becomes so limited when the buffer is filled up becomes the whole experience a little more frustrating. The battery life was pretty good on both cameras and no complaints there. The USB charging on the Sony is nice, but it's painfully slow and the cover flap is a bit awkwardly positioned. Also, the A7 III doesn't come with a charger. The sensor cover on the EOS R is nice, and I've owned this camera for almost a year and I never had to worry about cleaning the sensor. The A7 III, on the other hand, you have to be a little more careful with that. Perhaps the biggest deciding factor between these two cameras to some people might be the flip-out touchscreen on the EOS R. I never used to care about this on a camera, but just until about a year and a half ago, I never thought I would be shooting any videos. So if you're a video shooter, especially vloggers, I think this is a must-have feature. So in conclusion, I think the EOS R could attract a lot more professionals by having dual card slots, and I think the A7 III could attract a lot more vloggers and consumer-level video shooters by having a flip-out touchscreen. The in-body stabilization on the Sony is definitely nice, but it didn't really make a big of a difference as I thought it would. The stabilization on some of the newer Canon lenses are so good, in most cases it performs just as well as the Sony. And neither of these cameras' footages were perfect while walking. So lastly, let's talk about value. So Sony lenses are still usually more expensive than most Canon lenses, but with the RF lenses that are pretty expensive, now the price gap has closed down quite a bit. But on Canon's defense, they still offer a lot of the unique lenses that Sony and Nikon does not, for example, like some of the 1.2 primes, and also the RF mount 2.8 zooms like the 15-35 or the 24-70, which are now more expensive than the Sonys, but also they are stabilized unlike the Sonys. So it really comes down to which lenses you use, but overall you are going to be still spending a little more money with the Sony. So what have I learned from all this? Well, if I had to choose between one of these two camera systems today, I think I can honestly say now that I could be perfectly happy with either one of these. And I'm not just saying that to please both parties in the comment section, but I think I can honestly say that I could live with either one of these cameras. They both have their own strengths and weaknesses, and I don't think one camera is 100% better than the other like many people would like to believe. And obviously there are some things that you just cannot change with firmware updates, like the dual card slots on the Sony or the in-body stabilization, and also the arguably more comfortable grip on the EOS R or the flip-out touchscreens. And if you weigh out the differences, I think either one of these cameras could benefit you in different ways. Even when you're comparing things like image quality, just because Sony had better image quality, it doesn't necessarily mean that Canon's images were terrible. It's all about tolerances. And this is still miles better than anything Canon's offered before. And do you know how many professionals around the world are still using 5D Mark IIs and 3s? And for me to say that I can't do my job because this has terrible image quality, I mean, that's just plain stupid. And you also have to remember that both of these camera systems are changing so rapidly now. And with the A7 III, a lot of the things that I didn't like at the beginning, like the shape of the grip or the dials, they've already fixed a lot of those in the A7R4, so who knows what they're going to do with the A7 IV. And also with the EOS R, who knows what Canon's working on next and what kind of lenses and camera bodies they'll come out with next year. So I guess my conclusion is, well, again, unless one of these cameras has a specific feature that you really need, or unless one of these camera systems has a specific lens that you really need, then I don't think you're gonna go seriously wrong by choosing either one of these cameras. So that's it for me today, and if you have any more questions, just leave a comment down below and I'll try to get to them all. And thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.